On Friday, May 9, 1980, four heavily armed gunmen entered the Security Pacific Bank in Norco, California. By chance, a Riverside County Deputy Sheriff was at the intersection when the call came in. A fifth gunman waited in a van outside and warned his partners. When the gunmen came out, they exited with guns blazing. They were armed with semi-automatic rifles and pistols. The deputy was armed with only a revolver and a shotgun. The gunmen had also equipped themselves with homemade fragmentation bombs and grenade launchers. The suspects engaged the responding officers, who were seemingly hopelessly outgunned. What happened next was a 40-mile-long police pursuit into the Lytle Creek area of the San Gabriel Mountains. By the time it was over, 2 suspects would be dead, 1 officer killed, 8 officers and 2 bystanders would be wounded, as well as 2 suspects. At least 30 police vehicles would be damaged and a helicopter forced to land due to damage from gunfire. This was well before the time of body cameras and cell phones, but here are some of the audio dispatch recordings and photos from the day of the shooting.
Riverside to Norco units have a 211 in progress at the Security Pacific Bank, 4th and Hamner.
A 3-hour 50-1097.
3rd 50-1097. Riverside Dog, clear the air. Knowing the description? It's a green van, it's 4th and Hamner, they are shooting. Officer hit, clear the air, 1199.
Good shot, 4th and Hamner. 9 cock. 22 en route. 59, we're taking fire now.
Turn 59-10-9.
Hamner. Being fired upon.
Turn 59, copy. Riverside Dog units at the location are being fired upon.
Unit's been hit.
Hey there, this is Joe Vargas from Behind the Badge, and today we have the pleasure of speaking with Peter Houlihan, whose new book, or not so new, but Norco 80, is a great read on what happened in the 1980 shootout, which is now known as the Norco bank robbery shootout. It was the forerunner to what we later would know as the North Hollywood shootout and other significant law enforcement events, but this really was one that had a dramatic effect on police work. And Peter, I got to tell you, I read your book, and while I knew about the Norco shootout, I really did not know the Norco shootout until I read your book. Both, the people involved and what happened before, during, and almost as fascinating was what happened after this big shootout that took place. For our viewers, can you give us a quick recap of exactly what was the Norco bank robbery shootout?
Sure. Thanks, Joe. And by the way, I didn't know a lot about it until I wrote the book. I knew about the event, but the details and certainly the trial were all new to me. The Norco 80 bank robbery and shootout, as it is known, on May 9th, 1980, in the town of Norco, California, out in Riverside County, 5 young men attempted a takeover bank robbery of the Security Pacific Bank. That ended up being one of the most violent events in law enforcement history. It turned into a pitched gun battle in a busy Southern California intersection, a 40-mile running gun battle that went through neighborhoods and onto a busy Los Angeles area freeway, and ended 7,000 feet up on a fire road on the side of Mount Baldy in an ambush and shootout. And when it was all over, there were 3 dead, including a Riverside Sheriff deputy. There were 8 other police officers who were shot and wounded. There were a number of other civilians who were either shot or hurt in traffic accidents along the way. And 32 police vehicles were either disabled or destroyed by gunfire and homemade explosive devices that were thrown by the bank robbers, including a San Bernardino County Sheriff's helicopter that was downed over San Bernardino County, over Fontana. And then what's also notable is that the bank robbers themselves were armed with, well, first of all, they'd had no significant criminal records whatsoever before this, and they went into it armed with high-powered rifles, high-capacity magazines, thousands of rounds of ammunition, multiple high-capacity magazines that already loaded up, and they had made homemade explosive devices, fragmentation grenades that they could either launch from the barrel of their shotguns or light and toss out, in addition to Molotov cocktails, knives, sidearms, all kinds of things they had on them. And then, of course, the deputies, the main law enforcement events that played the largest roles were Riverside County Sheriffs, San Bernardino County Sheriffs, California Highway Patrol, and of course they were all armed with same thing they've been protecting the Wild West with for 100 years, a 6-shooter and a Winchester shotgun. So it was a case of the law enforcement being entirely outgunned in this instance.
Well, one of the things, I mean, one of the most dramatic things about this is the whole thing that it really was overkill on the part of the guys who perpetrated this robbery, because pretty much bank robberies, I was once told by an old detective that bank robbers are the misfits of criminals because the likelihood of getting caught is very high, and they take your picture when you come in. Yeah. And those kind of things. But the way they prepared and the way they executed this plan, this is long before the North Hollywood shootout. It really was overkill, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it was pretty unheard of at the time. Everything these guys did, especially the ringleader George Wayne Smith, had a grandiosity about it, and he had will never be taken alive sort of thing. And once he started arming up, he just armed up to the teeth. And at the time, I mean, traditionally, law enforcement knows most bank robbers are no passers, one-on-one bandits. And even in the world of takeover robberies, this was absolutely extraordinary for its time. North Hollywood later on, sure, there were others that began coming in with high-powered rifles later on, but these guys were real outliers and real wake-up call for law enforcement too.
Now let's talk a little bit about them. They really, when you look at the lives of these guys, the fact that they even got together, and they all had a history of bad decision making in their lives.
That is absolutely true. They were a very odd group of guys in the sense of their backgrounds and their motivations and things like that. Start with, say, the ringleader, the young man. They were all in their mid-20s, and then I'll talk about the Delgado brothers who were younger. But George Wayne Smith was 28 years old, and his couple of things that were in his background. Number one was a psychological makeup that was tended towards grandiosity and a disregard for his actions on others, especially strangers. However, up until that point, that had mostly been channeled for good. George was a guy that everybody said would do anything for you. He went out of his way to help people, to connect with people. He had also been swept up and was deeply involved in the aggressively evangelical born-again Christian movement that swept through the Orange County, actually originated in Orange County. It's known as the Jesus Movement in the 1970s. And these were churches whose ministries were heavily based on the rapture, Book of Revelation, the Second Coming, and destruction of the earth and mankind, cataclysmic events. And that was certainly a component to his motivation. He was a true believer in that. And again, I'm not suggesting that any of those ministries led one to bank robbery, but it was certainly a contributor to George Smith. He wholeheartedly believed that we were headed towards a catastrophic event, and he needed to prepare for it by having money, guns, buying a cabin up in the mountains of Utah so he could take all of his loved ones there and ride out the apocalypse or and then he recruited, he had a roommate named Christopher Harvin, who was just a bit of a troublemaker. Again, he had no criminal record whatsoever. These guys would do anything on a dare or, and then his little brother, Russ Harvin, who was really doing nothing with his life. Russ was about 26, 27 years old in Anaheim. All these guys were from Orange County. And then they recruited a young man named Manny Delgado, who was a landscaper at the City of Cypress Parks and Maintenance Department, along with Chris and with George. And Manny was 21 years old, and he recruited his 17-year-old little brother, Belisario, Billy Delgado, to be the driver. So those are the 5 guys involved. Chris and George lived together. Chris believed that the end of the world was coming in the, or, cataclysmic events in the form of natural disasters and doomsday scenarios that were very popular during the 70s. And they had a house together. They turned it into a fortress, strung barbed wire, dug a pit below from the backyard to under their house, and armed up. And then when they decided to do this bank robbery, they pumped all their other money into what money they had left into weapons. And, so that was your 5 that decided to rob the Security Pacific Bank in Norco.
And they were living in the city of Mira Loma, not too far from where the bank robbery actually took place. And even today, it's quite a rural community out there.
Yeah. I mean, those out there who know the Inland Empire, San Bernardino and Riverside County, they are definitely a different breed, especially back in 1980, before it had had a huge amount of commerce. It was rough and tumble. It was blue collar. It had a very rural feel to it, a very rural attitude in many ways. Norco itself went by the name of Horsetown, USA, and this was blue collar people who had horses in backyard corrals and would ride them down to the store to get groceries or whatever. So yeah, that it was Mira Loma was just a tough sparse neighborhood of working class blue collar folk.
So it's Friday, May 9th, 1980. Supposedly there's a lot of money in the bank right now because people are cashing their checks back when people still used real money to do things. Yep. And here comes a van load of crooks. And, the fact that they had just carjacked, a term we didn't really use back then, but they had just carjacked a van of a guy. And, what I didn't realize in the story was the person who they carjacked the van from was tied up in the back of the van during the robbery.
Yeah, Gary Hackala. He was the owner of the van. They had gone and at gunpoint taken his van. He was in the parking lot of the Brea Mall, and they 3 of them stuck a gun in his face, taped him up, stuffed him in a little closet he had in the back of his van, and then to use the van as the bank robbery. And they kept him because they didn't want the van reported stolen. But he ended up spending 5 hours in that van, including through an entire raging firefight in which that van was just absolutely riddled by gunfire. So he's lucky to be alive, and he's quite an interesting and a impressive guy, Gary Hackala.
And they take the van and they show up at the bank, and then they start to execute their plan. They light a bomb that doesn't go off.
Diversion bomb.
And somebody trips an alarm. So just about everything that could go wrong for them goes wrong for them. And on the other hand, the cops, just by sheer fate and circumstance, happen to be right there when things start going on. And a mixture of bad luck, as you know, is very often what is the downfall of a bank robbery, and then also some, in their case, over planning that really bogged this whole. They put together a plan where everything pretty much had to go right, and a few things did not. The bomb. The diversion bomb under a gas main a mile away didn't go off. Somebody spotted it, put it out. And then they happened to walk right out of that bank, headlong into a single Riverside sheriff's deputy who happened to be at that intersection when the 211 tone was dropped on that bank robbery in progress. Yeah. And then it just turns into a massive shootout. I mean, hundreds of rounds fired, and a deputy equipped with a 6-shooter and a shotgun, like you say. And this confrontation went on for over an hour, had so many different complexions to it, and changed. And the first was a pitched firefight in a crowded Southern California intersection at 3:30 in the afternoon on a Friday afternoon. Came out of a crowded bank, and this was a pitched battle, in which their van was disabled, their getaway driver killed by a single deputy who engaged them, which is Glenn Belaski, a miraculous story about his actions during that.
And then he was backed up by another two deputies, but again, firing Winchesters and six shooters. And this hundreds of rounds of ammunition were fired in this intersection.
Yeah.
And before they, grabbed a truck from a passing civilian and piled all their weapons into that, into a pickup truck that was converted into a heavy machinery road vehicle for maintenance, and took off in that, and then it became a running gun battle.
Mm-hmm. And in the first few minutes, I mean, there's several deputies that are wounded right off the get-go.
Yeah, and civilians. Luckily, there was a lot of people, deputies and civilians, who barely missed. The death toll in this could have been much worse.
Mm-hmm.
There was a civilian there that caught a bullet fragment that grazed the side of his head. His daughter caught a bullet fragment in the back. There were other police officers who were grazed in the head by close range fire from 223s, and George Smith had a 308, and 308's an absolute cannon. I mean, but yeah, there was civilians wounded, there was a police officer wounded, some of the bank robbers were wounded in that. So it was a real lethal, and they had their getaway driver killed.
So they wreak havoc and chaos here in this intersection in front of the bank. And they carjack this pickup, which pretty much you describe in your book as almost like a moving tank, because it is a work vehicle. And then begins the 40-mile pursuit involving dozens of units, different agencies, and they follow the circuitous route and end up in the mountains of San Gabriel. But between there, the bank, and the mountains, a lot takes place.
Yeah, again, it changes from a pitched firefight into a running gun battle, but that running gun battle changes complexion as well. First of all, it's through residential streets where they're just winding their way through. And at this point, you have city police, you have Riverside deputies converging on first the intersection of 4th and Hamden where the bank is, and later wherever this yellow pickup truck is being spotted. It's being tracked during the pursuit. You have California Highway Patrol who are self-dispatching off the highways. You have Riverside City Police. You have, and certainly Riverside Sheriffs. This is 1199 now, in which the deputy Glenn Belasty has been calling over the thing. I'm wounded. I'm bleeding badly. I need help. So everyone is now converging on this truck, on this intersection. And it just becomes these series of law enforcement does not fire a shot during this time, but you have unit after unit coming under heavy gunfire from two gunmen who are in the back of the pickup truck. Manny Delgado is now sitting out of the passenger window, shooting over the top of the cab, and Chris Harvin's behind the wheel with a long Colt, 44 in his long Colt pistol in his lap that he's firing out the window, and all the other three have high-powered semi-automatics. They have 223s, shorty AR, hecklers. George has a Heckler 308, and just a series of these unit after units. California Highway Patrol, Riverside are just coming under this incredible fire, and these officers are being wounded. I mean, you hear the 911. Radio traffic, the Riverside radio traffic, which I have every bit of it, and it is dramatic. In about I have to look at my numbers, but I think about 13 minutes you hear 7 officer down calls come over that, and that is astonishing to listen to.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that people don't understand, it in that day and age in 1980, it was hard for agencies to communicate with each other. They didn't have what we call these days interoperability, where they could talk to each other.
Yeah, Claymar's is just being implemented and was not in any of the vehicles. Those who had scanners could hear the other agencies. None of them could talk to each other. Some of them couldn't talk. Riverside City PD was the helicopter, Baker 1 at the beginning. Later it was San Bernardino helicopters. Riverside couldn't talk to San Bernardino helicopters, couldn't hear them, most of them. And it became a big deal. It became a big issue with tragic consequences for law enforcement in the end. But it was a real impediment to this pursuit.
Mm-hmm. So the officers are outgunned. They're having difficulty talking to each other. And you've got this moving vehicle with what we can describe as very desperate individuals trying to get away. And it gets up at one point where they don't even care if they're shooting at the police. They just start shooting at everybody, it seems like.
They are, and desperate, I think, is the term. Again, these were not hardened criminals. Some of them had almost no experience firing these type of weapons at all, but they became very prolific shooters when this started. I think they were jittery, and I don't think they, I have no reason to believe that they were intentionally had set out to kill or injure civilians, but they sure turned their weapons on them. So maybe I shouldn't say that. At some point, they turned to where they were just anything that would move, they would turn and fire on. They clipped a 10-year-old kid, just fired into a group of 10-year-old kids with riding their bicycles. Just barely clipped one on the tip of the finger, but they turned their guns right on civilians and were shooting civilian vehicles, which, this was absolute chaos. There were civilian vehicles, people running for their lives who were out there watering their lawns. There are civilian vehicles being shot and civilians being, wounded all along the way. I mean, there was one section of Belgrave that one of the deputies called the graveyard of cars, because he turned the corner in this pursuit and there were 3 police vehicles absolutely shot up and disabled, and 3 civilian vehicles in a 100-yard stretch that these guys had absolutely riddled with gunfire, in a matter of 10 seconds.
Mm-hmm. So while all this is going on, they're slowly trying to figure out probably where they're going to go. But eventually they make the decision to head northbound towards, if you're not familiar with Southern California, what would be the mountains that you see in those pretty pictures during the Rose Parade, and head up into those hills. But they also managed to take down a helicopter, which is pretty much unheard of.
Yeah, this is again where the pursuit changes its complexion entirely, and that's when they get on the freeway. And what they were first doing was trying to get back to their house, which they had again fortified out as a little bit of a fortress, a mini fortress of barbed wire and more weapons there. And when they realized they passed their house twice, and they had they had police right on them and a helicopter. So that's when they went to the freeway. And just a little sidelight, I don't know if it qualifies as irony, I guess maybe a little bit, but the cardinal rule of bank robbery in Southern California, which is the bank robbery capital of the world, 1/4 of all bank robberies in the United States happen within the jurisdiction of the FBI Los Angeles field office. And is you do it close to a freeway. You rob a bank, you get on a freeway in 5 minutes. If you pick the right time to travel on a freeway, you're in a complete different jurisdiction, cruising side streets. These guys were 9 miles away from the closest freeway. There's one there now, but it wasn't there then. And so when they get on the freeway, they are hitting police vehicles from a half mile away with these weapons. You have law enforcement pouring on to the freeway from all directions now. A whole new group get involved. That's the San Bernardino County Sheriffs, because when they get on the freeway, they quickly cross the border into San Bernardino County. You have city police from these areas, and California Highway Patrol now become a major factor because the highway is their turf. They rule the freeways, and they came from all directions, and they became heavily engaged in the pursuit at this point. And yes, George Smith turned his 308 on a San Bernardino Sheriff's helicopter that was shadowing them from above, and put a round through the skid that fragmented it and went through the electronics, filled the cockpit with smoke. And back in those days, as most helicopter law enforcement helicopter pilots were, this was a combat vet from Vietnam combat helicopter chopper pilot, and he managed to land a helicopter, and another San Bernardino helicopter then took its place. Mm-hmm. And they were also, this is where they started tossing fragmentation grenades out of the back of the truck on a busy Southern California freeway. And 3 or 4 of them, certainly 3, maybe 4 of them, were thrown out onto the freeway in an attempt to disable police vehicles pursuing.
Mm-hmm. Eventually, they end up heading up this back road up into the mountains. And that's where it gets really dangerous because, well, basically you have a line of cars. I mean, did we ever actually determine how many units went up the mountain?
The estimate is 40. The pursuit line was 40 law enforcement. And, if you know these mountains, the San Gabriel mountain range that rings the eastern part of the LA, the greater LA coastal basin. These are formidable mountains. These are no joke. They can shoot from virtually, right from the valley floor up to, in some cases, 10,000 feet very quickly. These are rugged canyons. They are prone to landslides, wildfires, flash floods. These are two-lane, one going each direction, and that then goes into dirt roads, that then goes into roads that should only be driven by heavy four-wheel drive vehicles, and eventually into fire roads that are harrowing. I mean, they cling to the mountainside. These are no civilian or anybody that is, unless they're extremely experienced, should ever be on. They have drops of hundreds of feet on one side and sharp inclines on the other. So that's what they were going up into when they went up into the San Gabriel National Forest.
Mm-hmm. What becomes significant in this, from what I understand, is that the officers, being heavily outgunned, did have access to one, M16 type rifle, but it was back at the station. So basically somebody came and was, have the guy go get the gun and bring it out.
Yeah, and this becomes very interesting in terms of its significance in the development of law enforcement afterwards, certainly in these two departments, is yes, San Bernardino Sheriff's Department, the Fontana substation, had a M16 military weapon, rifle, that was confiscated from some drug dealers. Military didn't want it back because the drug dealers had thrown it out the car window, so it had a bunch of road rash on it. None of these guys were trained on it. Some of them who'd been certainly in the military had been, but the young deputy who grabbed it, DJ McCarty, had no training in it. He grabs it out of essentially the evidence locker. At that point, it was in the trunk of a vehicle there, and jumps in the vehicle with another deputy, and they join the pursuit, and they're radioing saying, we got an AR, move over, everybody get out of our way. And they're going up this pursuit line, and they eventually become the number 2 law enforcement vehicle in the pursuit line, because the others are pulling aside, and the radio communication again is very spotty. DJ's either yelling out of the PA on the roof of the vehicle, or some of them are picking it up on a scanner and then relaying it to their other ones that, hey, they got an AR. Keep your eyes out for this SO unit coming up behind you. They got an AR and they're trying to bring it to bear. And so yeah, the law enforcement finally got one weapon involved in this that was not a 6-shooter or a shotgun.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're headed up the hill, and eventually the road becomes more treacherous, and the bad guys eventually find they can't go any further. And it's at that point where it really gets hairy, because the helicopter, I believe, loses sight of them for a few minutes there.
Yeah, this pursuit just keeps getting worse and worse and more dangerous and more ominous as it heads up this canyon. This is a notorious canyon anyways for meth labs and dumping bodies and all kinds of things. It's just, at that point it was known, and also a lot of people with just firing weapons off anywhere. It was law enforcement didn't like going up Lytle Creek anyways, and then the road keeps getting more and more narrow. It keeps rising in elevation. The road becomes a dirt road, as I said, and then eventually a fire road, single vehicle width fire road. So you can hear the strain in the lead. The deputy who has the lead now is Jim Evans, Riverside deputy. He has the lead in the pursuit. DJ McCarty and Jim McFerrin in the SO San Bernardino SO unit with the automatic are right behind him. Jim Evans doesn't know that they are right behind him, and you can hear the tension in Jim Evans' voice as he keeps going up this mountain, and it gets narrower and steeper and more harrowing. Jim Evans is 38 years old. He is a Vietnam combat veteran, Green Beret, just a wonderful human being, very impressive. The guys on the force completely looked up to him. He was just a cool customer. And you can hear him. He's at this point he has to communicate to a single Claymores that's in the hands of a narcotics detective in the pursuit line. Jim is talking to him. he is talking to the San Bernardino helicopter. San Bernardino helicopter is talking back to the Claymores, who's then relaying it to Jim Evans. And Jim Evans is trying to get information from the helicopter if that truck stops. These are horseshoe curves, hairpin curves, lots of loss of visibility, lots of dust being kicked up. And as they get up on these fire roads, the helicopter starts losing sight of this truck when it goes behind, areas of pine trees, or they have to reposition the helicopter to keep a view. So Jim Evans is constantly saying, I need to know if they stop. They're gone behind a curve. Have they stopped? That's what I need to know. And there are points where not only do you have the 15-second delay or so of relaying through the Claymores, you now have a helicopter that is losing sight of this truck frequently. And that is the conditions when the truck reaches a point that it cannot go any further.
And it's at that point that they set up an ambush.
They set up a full-fledged ambush. They all pile out, they line up behind the truck, and they wait for the police vehicles to come around the bend. And when Jim Evans and DJ McCarty and his vehicle come around the thing, they open fire with 3 semi-automatic, 2 AR-15s and a 308. And they absolutely riddle the pursuing vehicles. It may seem like, and I am telling a lot about this event, but as you know from reading the book, there are so many more details that I don't mind kind of giving this skeletal overview of how it unwinds. But that becomes a second firefight with Jim Evans firing his weapon. DJ McCarty eventually brings this AR-15 or this M16 that he has and he's never used before, and he has this harrowing few seconds or almost a minute of trying to load the clip into this thing and it falling out repeatedly as he's trying to force the round into the chamber because it's a beat up weapon, all the while under heavy gunfire. And these guys are now advancing on the line of police vehicles that have now been halted in their tracks on a single track road. Eventually DJ McCarty stands up and begins to fire this semi-automatic weapon. And that is what eventually scatters those bank robbers. And they turn tail and they head up this road and they disappear into the canyons of Lytle Creek. As dusk falls, cloud cover's moving in. So the helicopter can no longer see him, has to peel off and leave. So law enforcement holds its position and these guys disappear into the canyons.
Mm-hmm. Eventually, they bring out what could be described as an army of police officers to search the hills, including the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department SWAT team is brought out there. And eventually all of them are taken into custody with one. He does go down fighting.
Yeah, he does. The one of the interesting parts about this is that you had the 3 older guys, 26, 27, 28, especially Chris Harvin and George Smith, who are just bravado. We're never going to be taken alive. They'll never take us alive. Yet it's the 2 young Hispanic kids from the kind of the tougher areas of town that 21 and 17-year-old that end up dying in this. And then Manny Delgado, the one who truly doesn't get taken alive, although his death is a little unusual as well. But yeah, that was the largest manhunt in California history. I think there may have been a larger one more recently, looking for the the Los Angeles police officer who had engaged in the shooting. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting his name right now. But at the time, and for a long time afterwards, that was the largest manhunt in California history.
Yeah, that would have been Christopher Dorner manhunt.
Yeah, that one I think might have been bigger, but this was certainly tracking teams, horseback, dog teams, what they call the hunt and kill teams from Lasso, from the LA Sheriff's Office, and then there was also Riverside, San Bernardino City had SWAT teams up there. This was on the hillsides of Mount Baldy, mountainsides of Mount Baldy, which is the highest mountain in the range, tallest mountain in the range, and is bisected by LA County and San Bernardino County. So they were up there, and those they had split apart. They had all split up, and they were eventually tracked down throughout the day.
Yeah. Well, we eventually get 3 of the guys in custody. We get George Smith and the Harvin brothers are now in custody. there's a mess that's got to be cleaned up now. Detectives have to put together a crime scene that goes for 40 miles. There's a heck of a lot of work. But one of the things I found most interesting in the book is the trial afterwards becomes almost as dramatic as what happened during the shooting. And it ends up being one of the longest trials in California history, I believe.
Yeah, what the outcome of the trial in the sense of guilt and innocence was never in doubt. These guys were more or less caught absolutely red-handed, and they all in their interrogations afterwards, essentially absolutely admitted their participation. This trial was a surprise to me. I was aware of this event when it happened. I grew up nearby. And I was 17 years old at the time, and it absolutely captivated me, but I knew nothing of this trial. And it turned out to be such a wild affair, full of absurdities and confrontations and bizarre plot turns, and they were all tried together, which only makes everything longer and slower in terms of how the time it takes to get through it. But it eventually went on with, the jury selection alone, which is pretty widely recognized to be been a disaster, took 6 months. And don't worry, I don't spend a lot of time on it in the book. But there's so many twists and turns and strange things, and the personalities of these bank robbers start to reveal themselves and play themselves out in ways during the trial, as they did in life. And you have a complete new cast of characters, if you will. I understand they're real people, they're not characters, but that suddenly enter this story in the form of the prosecutors and the defense attorneys and the investigators, and the whole thing changes, which was a challenge as a writer, but then begins to unfold as an absolute courtroom drama, because it was a death penalty trial. So what was at stake was whether they would, was life and death for the guys on trial.
Mm-hmm. And you end up eventually they're all found guilty, but even the penalty phase of the trial turns into another whole separate trial within a trial. And,
if it couldn't get stranger, it absolutely did. George Smith manages to get himself named as a co-counsel, so he can effectively stand up and do part of the closing argument, which allows him to get up and make a statement without being cross-examined, but he can only speak about himself in the third person. So it takes on this very bizarre George Smith this, George Smith that, and then he is also speaking about his deep religious beliefs and how they are no excuse, but how they motivate. And he gets into very esoteric interpretations of the Book of Revelation, as well as kind of bizarre statements and claims. And Chris Harvin decides not to even put up a penalty phase defense. In fact, he and his attorney claim to be so disgusted with the jury and the judge that they won't rise when the jury enters the courtroom anymore. They just sit there, didn't call any witnesses. It's just a very, very strange situation all the way through.
And I'm going to leave the readers with something because they have to read the book. It really But in the midst of all that, there's a love story taking place too.
You could call it love.
But really,
I think, some would call it a little bit less than love. There was the public defender assigned an attorney, but also an investigator, a very attractive young woman named Jeannie Painter. She was a tough investigator. She was highly regarded. She'd been on. She was a veteran public defender investigator on hundreds of felony cases, and all as they go through this long trial that was moved to San Diego County. She develops a relationship with George Smith, and there are incidences of sexual misconduct, jailhouse sexual misconduct. Bringing drugs into accusations. I must say all these are accusations, because Jeannie Painter denies that they were indeed happened, and then that has a rather bizarre turn in the end after the trial is over as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I was going to leave our readers with that. They really got to read the book to figure out how this goes on. Eventually they're all convicted, and the jury can't come to a decision on a death penalty, so they do get life without parole, and they're all currently in prison here in the state of California. But
I interviewed the Harvin brothers
mhm.
um, in prison, and George Smith I wrote some letters back and forth with, but he, for the most part, respectfully declined to participate. But I had also spoken to ex-wives, girlfriends, family, friends, and things like that. So I had a good picture of George Smith, in addition to what he said about himself.
Hmm. Yeah, I especially love it. It's very touching, at least in the book, the impact upon the family of Deputy Evans. Especially, he had a newborn baby and his wife, and it's definitely a life-changing experience for that family.
It is a life-changing experience for so many of these law enforcement and frankly, the families of these bank robbers who had no guilt themselves. I mean, you had parents of the Harvin brothers whose kids went out the door one day and never came back. These were very law-abiding, upstanding, working people of Orange County who's, did not see this coming anywhere. Nor did the Smith family, George Smith, and then you had the Delgado brothers who walked out the door and never came back at all. I mean, died. And so the ripple effects, and then the law enforcement personnel who just really struggled with this event afterwards. They, so many of them had come under such terrifying gunfire, and been wounded, and to be shot at close range by a high-powered semi-automatic rifle is especially when one minute you were always a dangerous job, particularly obviously back then as well as now, but you just didn't see that coming back then. And then to find yourself so outgunned, so helpless, and then to lose someone like Jim Evans, who everyone looked up to. And the impact, of course, on the Evans family was, and the backstory on Jim Evans is really incredible. It's the one thing I wish I could have told more about, but had to, for space reasons, leave a lot of it out. But he was a amazing man. He was an amazing human being, and just everyone looked up to him. Everyone liked him. To lose Jim Evans was rough.
But the last thing I want to touch in is the fact that this really became a model for pretty much what not to do when police officers are involved with shooting, because it really brought to attention the PTSD experienced by the officers. We all know it and describe it as that now. The profession does a much better job. But in those days, it was a fairly new field. I mean, I can recall in the 80s, if an officer was involved with shooting, debriefing involved going and having a beer at the bar afterwards. And that was pretty much the extent of it.
Yeah, the real thing is that the science has certainly improved, but law enforcement, first responders, were not addressing it as aggressively as they do now, and it was not as widely recognized in terms of the types of experiences that could lead to it, in policing, it so many officers, not just from this, but at that time and now, drop out from stress-related things, heart attacks, early health problems, broken marriages, all kinds of things from being involved in many different types of events. And this was certainly on such an enormous scale. They felt like they had, they'd lost an officer. They felt like they'd really been beat up on this. They really turned on their own department. They were angry at them for not having the right weapons, for not having the right communications, for not having the right training. It wasn't necessarily justified in the case of the Riverside Sheriff's Department. They were really no farther behind than anyone else. But it was a wake-up call for law enforcement, first of all, in the area, for sure, that they really couldn't hold back in a lot of these areas, especially the way they were armed. And then more aggressively, some real lessons learned in just addressing post-traumatic stress disorder, officer, officers who've gone through traumatic events of many different varieties.
Okay. Well, Peter, I'd like to thank you for your time. I really did enjoy your book. I recommend to any of our viewers or followers, pick it up. It is a great true crime drama. I think NPR said it was one of the best true crime drama books of the year. So pick up a copy since you're sitting at home with this COVID quarantine. If you're looking for something to read, it is really well worth the time reading it. Anyway, Peter, thank you for your time. And
thank you. I really appreciate it. This has been great.
Okay. And it's been good having you.
Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to this podcast from BehindTheBadge.com. Please follow us on our social media accounts on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube.